You're watching Fugitive Red Eye, and welcome to another CreepyPasta review. Today I'll be reviewing No End House, which is my favorite creepypasta of all time. Now, I heard it back when Mr. Creepypasta first narrated it, and back when I first heard it, I loved all three parts. I didn't listen to his own sequel that he made, because I was looking forward to part 3 to be finished. Unfortunately, the creator of No End House never finished it, and doesn't really have any plans to do so. I still haven't listened to Mr. Creepypasta's personal sequel that he made to it, but that's for good reason. First reason is, I want this to be pure, just straight-up No End House review. Second off, I don't really care what happens after, and I'll explain that in a minute. So as I said, when I first heard it back in the day, I actually really liked all three parts. There was originally No End House, then No End House 2, then No End House 3 Part 1, because 3 was unfinished. And No End House 1 is still fantastic. So I'll give you a brief synopsis of the story. So No End House is the story of this guy named David, who finds out about this haunted house, that if you go through every room in the haunted house, you win $500 cash. And he decides he's gonna do it and get the $500. The gimmick of this haunted house is each room that you go in gets progressively more and more disturbing. It starts out with like simple plastic toys and things like that, then a smoke machine. But then as he starts going through, the house starts like shape-shifting and doing all sorts of weird shit, and he starts being like followed by this hum. He keeps feeling something behind him, and every time he turns around, there's nothing there. And on top of that, there's like a forest inside the house, and there's some things that seem to be demonic in nature. But in No End House Part 1, there are no answers, and that's part of its strong suit. Suffice to say, there may be a few spoilers ahead. I'm going to try and avoid them, but in order to talk about the plots to Parts 2 and 3, there's gonna have to be some spoilers, unfortunately. So, without going into too much detail about each of the rooms, because I really want you to listen to it yourselves, suffice to say, David never comes back home. He ends up just kind of trapped. Well, that's where Part 2 picks up. Part 2 is about his girlfriend, Maggie. David's missing, and she gets this message from David's friend who told him about the No End House. And basically, she ends up going to the No End House to try and find David. Now, David's girlfriend, Maggie, is the main focus of Part 2. And I'm gonna be honest, Part 1 was captivating as hell. Part 1 is perfect. Like, I honestly cannot think of a single flaw with Part 1. But Part 2 is pretty boring. It's an okay story. I still liked it, but I honestly didn't care. It started to bore me, because any of the stuff Maggie goes through is nothing compared to the shit David went through. All of the rooms David went through in Part 1 were way more fucked up than any of the rooms that Maggie went through. Now granted, from what I understand, No End House sort of adapts to each person's individual fears. So I guess Maggie's fears just aren't as fucked up as David's. Hers is pretty straightforward, and again, more spoilers ahead, but at the end she has to kill that friend that told her and David about the No End House because he was behind it all along somehow. And then she basically, after she kills him, she basically gets trapped in the No End House and becomes the new management, but David gets set free. And we get to Part 3. Part 3 is unfinished, so there's hardly any plot to it. Part 3 has David going back to No End House to try and get Maggie this time, but this time going through like a little service entrance. Also, that friend that Maggie killed isn't dead in Part 3 for some reason, and basically, from what I understand, if you kill management, you become management, which is what that's what they called him, because he managed the No End House. Again, it's dumb. In Part 1, they didn't have any management, like there were little notes that said from management, but it was very mysterious and ominous. In Parts 2 and 3, when they have someone actually be the management, that kind of takes away from the magic of it. But then Part 3 fucks it up even further. I honestly do not like Part 3 at all. Part 1, perfect. Still my all-time favorite creepypasta. Part 2, it's okay, but it's boring. Part 3 is fucking terrible. And let me tell you why. So Part 3, he goes back into the No End House and he meets this girl. Apparently this girl is their friend's sister, the friend who told them about No End House. And then she mentions that the No End House was her house and her brother's house, and her brother is the friend, like I said, from Parts 1 and 2. And apparently they were into some like black magic or something, and then because Part 3 was never finished, you don't find out exactly what. Basically, it was a normal house until their family started doing some weird cult shit, and cliche, you get the point. I don't like Part 3, which is why I didn't have any interest in listening to Mr. Creepypasta's fan-made Part 4. Granted, maybe he fixes it and ties it up really well, I don't know. I also haven't watched the Channel Zero No End House yet, although I do own it, and I will be watching and reviewing it shortly. I wanted to come into this just with the original source material, No End House Parts 1 through 3. Again, I recommend you listen to Part 1. Do not listen to Part 3. Part 2 is optional, but Part 1 is a must listen to. It is an all-time classic creepypasta, and it still holds up to this day. I loved it just as much this time listening to it as I did the first time. Now, I do know Channel Zero's is probably based more on Part 2, although she goes in with a group of friends, so it's probably going to be dumb, but we'll get to that when I actually watch it. But overall, No End House Part 1 is a solid 10 out of 10. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. Part 2, I'd say probably about a 5 out of 10. It's okay, not great, but it's harmless. Part 3, probably about a 2 out of 10. It's fucking terrible. Anyway, that's my review of No End House. Do let me know what creepypasta you guys want me to review next, and have a great rest of the day.
Subscribe. feed it to Red Eye.